big taboo subject when it comes to buying real estate or investing in real estate. Because one, some of the values are there in terms of, preserving the land and preserving the culture. And I'll get into that in a second. This is just a quick video. But what ends up happening though, and I see this more often than not, is with a lot of First Nations. I use the term First Nations, by the way. I don't like the term Indigenous. But with a lot of First Nations and my reserve, and I'm being Algonquin from Kitigan Zibi, one of the things that we had was a thing called the global settlement. And it was this very seedy selling of the land. And with the town of Maniwaki, which is neighboring the reserve, it was a very seedy deal. So everybody in the community got around 14,000 or 14,700, I think was my, and again, it was extremely seedy. There was a whole political play for a regime that's been in power to keep power. That's usually how they do it, is they just buy off the people. Anyway, I don't want to get into that too much in this video. There's a lot of issues that came with it in terms of, for example, even Canada with the Liberal government and the Deschanel case. All these people who had really no connections to the reserve suddenly were entitled to the same amount of money. And that, like, these people who traced, I think now you could trace back to 1890, which is just asinine in my opinion. And one of the things is going back is going back, it's just, it's so wrong. Like, even myself, I'm mixed race. My father's non-native. I grew up definitely in the culture, and grew up, and I'm also seeing it fade very quickly, which is also really sad. And it's not being preserved as well. All this money is getting thrown for preservation, but due to the same corrupt regime trying to keep power, it's just, we end up, the culture just, each year I see it get eroded, and we lose less competent people and less speakers of the culture just anyway. But not getting into that, it's just a little bit of a backstory. One of the things that's going back is, for example, with the Algonquin land, for example, the global settlement, where they sold the land because our land title's unceded because we never signed any treaties with the government. So this global settlement ended up, again, personally, I was against it. Anything to do with bans generally is pretty seedy. But, going back to it, is the thing that was aggravating about this is when I was working I worked for the band office. Back at that point, I was basically a social worker, which was, the title was pre-employment, but you weren't paid the salary of a social worker. One of the things is we're part of the distribution of this money, and right away you seen the money wasted on things. And, again, because people don't have that financial knowledge, let alone that discipline, a lot of the money went straight back into the town. So the town bought off the reserve, and then the money went back in the town. And I'm not saying this to down the business owners or by any means, but for example, like, everybody bought an ATV, a side-by-side, which was a chattel. Half of them I see now are all broken down, and 4 years after, and 3-4 years after, they're broken down now. Or people bought cars, and again, people for some reason here really like having new cars and keeping up with the Joneses, so they're always releasing cars and refinancing cars. And so all this money went back to the car dealers in town and back into the business in a town, and very little went into the actual reserves economy. So a lot of people were arguing, oh, it's good for the it's good for the native people, it'll boost it. But very few times I've seen a lot of this money that comes of this go to actual native business, because we don't have that infrastructure on reserve, and we'd be competing against it. So instead, people just waste it on chattels and liabilities, and that goes to talk about good debts and bad debts, right? And this is where I get into the real estate aspect, is had people invested into a down payment for a rental property, or down payment for a rental property, so that money brings revenue back in, so you're created passive income. So if you've created an asset, it would be a good debt, because you pay, automatically it pays back the debt of taking a bank loan, and at the same time it also pays, if you can make a profit off of it, it's more than just putting your money into a mutual fund. One of the biggest things I see is, for example, having been a band office employee and having had to work there, I was also economic development officer for the community of Kitigan Zibi, and I had a previous video on that whole experience. It was an extremely corrupt experience, but it's always this thing where it's people trying to keep up with people always trying to keep up with the Joneses and appear rich when they actually are not. And again, these people aren't investing, and like my community's people aren't investing in assets. Even when they get bank loans, like one of the most common things I've seen, and again, is with funds, is they're not buying assets to grow their business, they're buying chattels or non-performing assets. And right away they go buy, like a brand new truck, and it's not like they're writing off the taxes on the truck if they have a tax bill for taking off reserve money. And people seem to think that on reserve is some sort of tax haven from the government. It really isn't. It comes with its own set of challenges, and a lot of those challenges are not documented. But again, like going back is to the whole real estate thing, is why real estate is so awesome in terms of collecting it. Is one, you buy land, you're also buying equity in the region that you're buying in. So you have, the more property you own, basically the more power you have in terms of, I do it because I want to rent to people and provide a service. In the neighboring town, which there's a lot of Algonquin people from other communities who go there for a better quality of life, because there's a lot of third world poverty, for example, in the neighboring communities like Rapid Lake, and there's a bunch of, like hunters villages out of it. So people want a better standard of living, or they have medical services they need. So one of the things why I enjoy doing real estate as well is I'm providing rentals for my people, and I'm also serving them. And that's part of entrepreneurship, is you're also providing a service in helping people. And it's thinking about that. But at the same time with real estate, it's just thinking about it long term, is having invested, I had no choice to invest in this and I wouldn't have entertained it, but having invested in mutual funds, working for the band, they have never performed, and especially with COVID, with the market fluctuations, I ended up losing a lot of money. I also invested a lot in the stock market as well, especially during the dip. And although stocks are great and I recommend it, there's a lot of skills you could learn, like learning to interpret a financial spreadsheet and learning to determine the value of a company. One of the things that I find with it is real estate still outperformed it in terms of a stability of income. The other thing is, I like the saying is they're not making any more land. So the other thing is, your land value goes up. And depending on your business system, you could also write off the depreciation of your building, a lot of services costs. Again, this is not financial advice, but you can write off a lot of different, you could write off the repairs and the equity. And again, one of the big things with real estate when you're getting started is if you know how to do a lot of the repairs yourself, especially things that don't require a professional sign off, like electrical and plumbing. If you could do a lot of things like, for example, changing a sink, doing things like changing a door or fixing your doorknobs, again, that's sweat equity. And what I mean by that is you're also putting the time into it as well. And it also raises the property's value. And again, if you could keep your tenants happy, one of the things is, again, you have that longevity of business. And for me, why I got into real estate was I started thinking of ways, for example, when it comes to my retirement and what I'm going to leave for my son, because I'm a single parent. I seen my grandparents really struggle, for example, on the band's retirement plans, where they're basically screwed, and on government pensions. And especially my grandmother, who worked as a teacher, had camped in this other reserve called Ganawage, which is just in Montreal, so she could get a teaching degree. And her efforts for that were never recognized. She also brought a language program for the Algonquin language to try and save it. She was never recognized. Her efforts were never recognized by the band, to the point where she had to buy a Xerox machine in the 80s. And to see the poverty that my grandparents lived in their retirement, being dependent on band employees and being dependent on just working on the system. My grandfather was fairly well off, but my grandmother was basically duped a comfortable retirement for the amount of work she did. And that's why I say, if you're coming on a reserve, reserves are not your friend. But if you want to live on reserve for the whole cultural aspect, or if you have children, for them to be connected that way, one of the things that it's important is you need to think about your asset class, especially as these things start coming out, for example, like these government settlements. Because, for example, seeing my community just waste one on basically just garbage that they didn't need, it's a little bit heartbreaking and maddening, as well as there was a lot of collections on addictions as well. So again, don't waste the money if you have these opportunities like that, to use it as a down payment or even just save. Real estate's one of the more simple ones, but if you could figure out even investing in a business and just creating that passive revenue stream, anything you could do to basically not become dependent on the band and the Indian Act system, as well as, building yourself up later on for your retirement or thinking about your future, you'll have more power and you'll have more equity. Anyway, that's just a quick one. I'm still figuring out these videos as it goes along. I'm really enjoying making them. And yeah, I'll also put this on the podcast. So this is part of, the Sheldon Show, and also on Eagles and Pigeons. All right. Thank you. Bye.